The Grand Hall of Ouagadougou was tense, draped with flags of African nations that had fought tooth and nail for freedom. At the podium, Emmanuel Macron's voice carried with the sharpness of French history. "Colonies owe us loyalty," he declared, his words slicing through the air like the echo of chains long broken but never forgotten. The room stiffened. His tone carried the arrogance of centuries, as if Africa's independence was a favor, not a right. Cameras clicked, journalists leaned forward, and whispers stirred like a storm gathering momentum. Macron's gaze was steady, daring anyone to challenge him, as though France still held the master key to Africa's destiny. For a moment, silence blanketed the hall, pressing down on everyone present. The air was heavy with the ghosts of exploitation, the weight of stolen gold, and the blood of ancestors who had resisted. Macron's words did not simply echo, they provoked, opening the wound of colonial arrogance once again. And at that very moment, every eye turned to one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Would he absorb the insult like so many before him? Or would he, as the embodiment of Africa's fiery defiance, strike back with words sharp enough to dismantle centuries of dominance in a single breath? The audience waited, breathless, for Africa's answer. Traoré rose slowly, not with the theatrics of an old empire, but with the calm certainty of a new century. His chair scraped the marble like a flint striking steel. He adjusted his military jacket, glanced at the flags of liberated nations, and stepped to the mic. No notes. No handlers. Just a steady gaze and a voice that carried farther than any cannon. "Loyalty," he said, almost softly, and the word felt like it had nowhere to hide. To whom? To the hands that signed decrees while our grandmothers buried sons? To the banks that priced our futures, the cartels that priced our minerals, the textbooks that priced our dignity? A low murmur rippled through the hall. Traoré let it travel, then cut it clean. "You don't ask a freed man for loyalty to the chain that scarred his wrist." He looked directly at Macron. "France did not gift us liberty. Our people took it, in the bush, in the streets, in prisons, in whispers that became roars. Every ounce of freedom here was paid with names you don't pronounce and bones you don't catalogue." He lifted a hand toward the audience. "And still, you speak of loyalty, as if history is a debt we must keep paying with our silence." Traoré's voice firmed, measured like a drumline before a march. "We owe you nothing. Not our gold. Not our seasons. Not our children's minds. If there is a debt, it is owed to the widows of miners, the farmers taxed by currency they did not control, the students who learned the map of Paris before the rivers of their own country." He paused, then softened, just enough to sting. "But understand this, our refusal isn't hatred. It is healing. True friendship is not built on tribute. If France wishes a future with Africa, it will be eye to eye, hand to hand, not hand over fist." Cameras clicked like hail. A few diplomats shifted, guilty in ways that had nothing to do with France. Traoré leaned in for the line that would travel further than any envoy: "The era of invoices to our past is over. From today, we invest only in our future." The room was no longer just diplomats and cameras, it was history itself, dragged into the present. Macron's face had tightened, but Traoré pressed on, voice gaining the weight of a continent. "You speak of loyalty as though Africa is some extension of your estate," he said, his tone sharp enough to slice the silence. "But loyalty is earned, not demanded. And France has earned none from Africa." He took a slow step forward, his boots echoing against the polished floor. "For decades, our fields were emptied for your tables, our mines drained for your lights, our rivers dammed for your industries. And when the sun rose over Paris, you dared to call it civilization. But when it rose over Ouagadougou, you called it dependency." Murmurs stirred, but Traoré raised his hand, not to silence them, but to guide their attention. France chained Africa with currencies it printed, with treaties it dictated, with soldiers it stationed. And now, when the chains rattle loose, you call it betrayal? No, Monsieur Macron, it is freedom. It is overdue. He let the words breathe, scanning the crowd of world leaders. His gaze landed not only on Macron, but on every ally, every bystander complicit in silence. We are not asking permission to exist. We are not submitting reports for approval. We are telling you, Africa decides. Africa builds. Africa rises. His voice thundered now, the rhythm of a commander at war and a father at prayer. Every chain you forged is broken. And every door you once locked, we have built keys of our own. No loyalty can be owed to oppressors. Loyalty belongs only to the land, to the people, to the future. The hall erupted, some in applause, others in discomfort. Macron leaned back, lips pressed tight, but Traoré did not look at him again. His words were not just aimed at France, they were aimed at the world. The tension in the hall was almost visible, hanging like heavy smoke. Macron's jaw tightened, his polished composure cracking for just a moment. Cameras flashed, trying to capture the tremor of history being made in real time. Traoré stood firm, his posture not of defiance alone, but of sovereignty. He let the silence linger, forcing Macron and his allies to sit in it. Then, with deliberate calm, he continued. You speak as though France still holds the keys, Traoré said, his voice even but sharp. But keys only work if the doors are still locked. And Africa's doors are wide open now, to the future, to our people, to the partners we choose. A ripple ran through the room. Some leaders exchanged nervous glances, others lowered their eyes. Macron cleared his throat, leaning toward the microphone, but Traoré cut across him with the weight of finality. You mistake obedience for order. You mistake silence for loyalty. But what you truly mistake, Monsieur Macron, is Africa's patience for weakness. That patience has ended. The audience stirred again. Traoré's hand rested on the podium as though anchoring himself to the soil of every African nation. For too long, the world has seen us through the lens of what France built, or what France broke. But hear me now, Africa's story is no longer written in Paris. It is written in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Kinshasa, in every place where African hands build without asking permission. He paused, scanning the hall. His eyes met Macron's for the briefest moment, not in anger, but in declaration. So understand this clearly, the era of France holding keys is over. Africa does not need to borrow doors, or beg for entry. We build our own homes, our own futures. And there is no lock that can hold us anymore. The hall erupted, some clapping hesitantly, others with thunderous conviction. Macron leaned back, his expression a storm barely contained. But Traoré had already shifted his gaze past him, toward the world that was finally listening. The air in the hall grew denser with every passing second. Macron adjusted his tie, his voice tightening as he tried to reclaim control. Traoré, do not forget, he said, forcing a smile that failed to mask his unease. It was France that brought roads, schools, and order to Africa. Without our guidance, where would you be? A murmur spread through the crowd, some nodding in silent agreement, others shifting uncomfortably at the arrogance of the remark. Traoré leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Macron, his words steady as steel. You confuse occupation with order. You confuse exploitation with progress. The schools you built taught us to serve you. The roads you paved were not for Africans, they were for your soldiers, your companies, your plunder. Do not come here and pretend you gave us gifts. You only gave us chains. The room stirred louder now. Macron's lips parted, but no words came. Traoré pressed on, his tone rising with the momentum of history itself. You say we should be grateful. Grateful for what? For the generations stripped of their land, their languages, their dignity? For the millions who toiled so your empire could feast? France did not civilize Africa, it bled Africa dry. Cameras flashed wildly, the moment already immortalized. Traoré's voice carried above the whispers. You ask where we would be without you? I ask you, where would France be without Africa's gold, Africa's cotton, Africa's blood? You built your empire on our backs, and now you dare call it charity? The audience broke into applause, some rising to their feet. Macron sat rigid, his knuckles white as they gripped the edge of the table. Traoré's final words cut through the uproar like a blade. France may have built monuments in Paris with African hands, but today we build monuments of freedom in Africa with our own. The legacy you cling to ends here, not with gratitude, but with truth. The silence that followed Traoré's words was heavy, almost suffocating. Macron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his polished statesman mask beginning to crack. He finally raised his voice, laced with both pride and defensiveness. You speak of chains, but without France's hand, Africa would have remained in darkness. We carried the light of civilization to your lands. You owe us your very identity. Gasps rippled across the room. Some of Macron's allies nodded, but others looked away, embarrassed at the bluntness of the claim. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch, every glance. Traoré leaned back, his calmness striking in contrast to Macron's unease. Then, with piercing clarity, he spoke. Darkness? Our ancestors built kingdoms when Europe still wandered in forests. Our identity existed long before your empire dreamed of conquest. You did not give us light, you tried to extinguish it. The audience broke into murmurs of approval. Traoré continued, his voice gathering force. You carved borders with rulers and guns, and then told us to thank you. You stripped our lands, exported our gold, our cotton, our people, and now, centuries later, you still dare to call it civilization? No, Monsieur Macron, it was not light you brought, it was fire. And we carry the scars to prove it. Macron's lips tightened, but Traoré gave him no escape. His next words echoed with defiance. Look around you today. Africa is rising, not because of France, but in spite of it. We have our own languages, our own cultures, our own future. And we will no longer allow Paris to dictate what Africa is, or who Africa must become. The age of colonial debt is over. The hall erupted into applause, reporters shouting questions over the thunder of clapping hands. Macron lowered his gaze, his silence louder than any rebuttal he might have prepared. Traoré ended with a phrase that rang like a verdict. Africa owes you nothing, France. Not loyalty. Not gratitude. Not silence. The chains are broken. And we will never wear them again. The thunder of applause faded, but the tension in the room only thickened. Macron's aides scribbled frantically, whispering into each other's ears. The French president leaned forward, his jaw stiff, his voice sharper than before. You speak of scars, Traoré. But who will heal them? Without France, your nations would crumble under chaos. We gave you governance, infrastructure, and the institutions you now claim as your own. Do not mistake independence for stability, it was built on our foundations. Gasps rose again. Macron's words, meant as strength, instead exposed the very arrogance Traoré had denounced. Traoré stood, his military jacket gleaming under the lights, his presence commanding. He took a deep breath, then spoke with unwavering resolve. Governance? You call it governance when our kings were dethroned, our lands divided, and our people enslaved? You built railways, yes. But they led only to the ports where our resources were stolen. You built schools, but they taught us to forget our names, our languages, our gods. You gave us foundations of dependency, not stability. His words carried a weight that pressed upon every listener. Even Macron's supporters could not look away. Traoré's voice grew stronger, resonating like a war drum. Stability cannot be built on chains. Africa has endured wars, hunger, and sanctions not because of what we lacked, but because of what was taken from us. And yet, here we stand. Stronger. United. Resilient. We are not crumbling, Mr. Macron. We are rising. The hall shook with a mixture of cheers and stunned silence. Reporters' cameras flashed wildly, capturing the confrontation in every angle. Macron's lips parted as if to respond, but Traoré raised a hand, silencing him before a word could leave. We will heal ourselves, Traoré declared, his eyes locked on Macron's. We will build institutions that reflect Africa's soul, not France's shadow. And when history looks back, it will not say that France gave Africa stability. It will say that Africa tore down every wall of oppression and built its own future. The crowd erupted into chants of Africa. Africa, echoing through the grand chamber. Macron, isolated, sat back, his silence now a confession. The chamber air was heavy, like a storm about to break. Macron sat stiffly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrests of his chair. The French leader tried to muster composure, but his eyes betrayed unease. His voice, when it finally returned, wavered between frustration and desperation. You speak boldly, Traoré, Macron said, forcing a thin smile. But boldness alone does not feed nations. France has invested billions into Africa's growth. We have offered trade, security, and aid. Without us, your independence is only words. The reality is simple, Africa still needs France. The words rippled through the hall like a stone tossed into water, creating waves of disbelief. The arrogance was undeniable, yet delivered as though it were charity. Traoré rose again, his presence filling the chamber like a towering oak. He allowed a pause, a long, deliberate silence, before responding. The world seemed to lean in, waiting for his reply. Need? Traoré repeated, his tone sharp as steel. What Africa needs is not France's aid, not France's conditions, and not France's approval. What Africa needs is freedom from the cycle you created, where we are made dependent, then told we are incapable without you. His words struck like hammer blows. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his expression. You speak of billions invested, Traoré continued, his voice deepening. But how many trillions have been stolen? How many generations robbed of their wealth, their dignity, their futures? Aid is not generosity, it is repayment. And yet, even in repayment, you come with chains hidden behind contracts and soldiers. The hall buzzed with murmurs, but Traoré silenced them with a single gesture. His hand extended, palm open, as if laying truth itself before the world. We are not beggars at France's table, he declared. We are builders at our own. And your empire's illusion of necessity ends today. The chamber exploded in cheers and chants, louder than before. Macron, still seated, found himself drowned in the echo of voices rising for Africa. His silence was no longer power, it was defeat. The hall no longer felt like a diplomatic chamber, it had transformed into an arena of truth. Macron sat frozen, his expression betraying both irritation and helplessness. His carefully constructed image of control had cracked, and the world was watching the fracture spread. Traoré did not waste the moment. He stepped forward, his boots striking the marble floor with measured force, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. He raised his voice, not in anger, but with the calm conviction of a man carrying the weight of a continent. You claim loyalty is owed to France, Traoré said, his gaze locked onto Macron. But loyalty is earned, not demanded. And France has earned only resentment, for the minds stripped bare, for the hands shackled in poverty, for the children who grew up without futures because their wealth was shipped across the sea. The audience erupted, many nodding, some clapping, others shouting in agreement. Cameras from every angle captured the intensity of his delivery. On social media, clips spread instantly, captions flashing, Africa owes nothing. Macron attempted a retort, his voice sharp, history cannot be rewritten, Traoré. The world runs on cooperation, and France has always been a barrier, not a bridge, Traoré cut in, his words slicing like a blade. You came to teach us civilization, yet you destroyed civilizations that thrived long before France raised its flag. You came to bring order, but left chaos. You came claiming to guide, yet only to control. The tension rose so high it was palpable. Even Macron's allies in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, aware that every attempt at justification only deepened France's isolation. Then Traoré's tone shifted from indictment to vision. His voice softened, but the firmness remained unshaken. We are not asking for your permission to be free. We are declaring it. Africa is not the shadow of Europe. Africa is the sun rising on its own path. And no empire, past or present, will block its light again. The chamber thundered with applause, some delegates standing, others pounding their fists on the desks in approval. Macron leaned back, silent, while Traoré stood tall, the embodiment of a new era. The turning point had been reached. Africa's defiance was no longer just words, it was history being rewritten in real time. The chamber, still trembling from the storm of Traoré's words, had fallen into a silence so thick that even the faint hum of cameras felt deafening. Emmanuel Macron sat motionless, his once confident posture reduced to stillness, while the delegates' eyes remained fixed on the young African leader who had just shaken centuries of dominance with a single speech. Traoré raised his hand gently, not to silence but to prepare the world for his final declaration. His voice came steady, carrying the weight of ancestors whose voices had been silenced and the hope of millions whose voices were rising now. You said colonies owe you loyalty, Traoré declared, turning once more toward Macron, but Africa owes you nothing. We have carried the chains you forged. We have buried generations under the weight of your greed. And yet here we stand, not broken, but stronger. He paused, scanning the hall, his eyes meeting those of allies and skeptics alike. France is no longer the center of our story. Africa writes its own chapters now. Our wealth stays on our soil, our people rise on their own strength, and our future belongs only to us. A thunderous applause broke out, louder than before. Some delegates rose to their feet, others banged the tables in solidarity. Macron's lips tightened as the camera zoomed in, capturing his silence beside Traoré's towering words. The young leader then delivered the closing line that would echo beyond the chamber, beyond the headlines, and into the memory of history. Empires fall when the people awaken. Today, Africa is awake. And no crown, no flag, no nation will ever again put it to sleep. The hall erupted. Outside, the streets filled with chants as news spread like wildfire. Across social media, across borders, across continents, one phrase trended above all others: Africa owes you nothing. It was no longer just a statement, it was a movement.